let us understand some important parts of our business intelligence project. The very first is creating the data source. Data source creation. It is a very important step because on the data, everything is dependent. From this data only, we will be retrieving the information. And this information will be utilized for the benefit of the organization. So, data is a very important thing. So, data source is a location where that data that is being used, it originates from. The source of data. That means where our data is. The location where data that is being used, it originates from. A data source, it may be the initial location where the data is born or where physical information it is first digitized. However, even the most refined data, it may serve as a source as long as another process access and utilize it. So, our data source, it can be a database in which we store all our data. It can be a flat file, simple file which can be used. It can be an XML file which can be used or any other format that a system can read. So, the input, it is recorded as a collection of records that contains information which will be used for the business processes. So, basically data source. Data source is the origin of the data. Suppose you are watching movie on Netflix. Whenever you click on any movie, that is a kind of data that will work for the updating of that app. So that will be your data. Now this data, like you have clicked on this movie, this has to be stored into a data source, into a location. So that next time related, if you have watched an action movie, so other action movies, they will be displayed to you. So even a single click on your mobile, on your laptops, on your TV, they will serve as a data for the business intelligence project. And this data, it has to be stored into some source. Now this source can be a file, can be a database, can be any other format which the system can read. So that is what our data source is. Now, databases, they are the most traditional type of data source. We prefer to keep our data into the databases. And there are a number of different databases available. And many vendors providing databases with different architectures and different features. Common databases which are used today, which include MS Access, which is one database which may be used for storing the data. Oracle, that is another database which can be used. DB2, Informix, SQL, MySQL, Amazon SimpleDB, etc. These are few of the examples of databases which can be used, and when we use them, they can be used very efficiently to store the data. So now, after understanding about databases, that what our databases are. Databases, they store our data. Whatever data we keep, we click on, we input, that data has to be stored into a particular place. Databases, they are the most traditional type of data source. Now, we will understand in this particular unit the steps to follow the process. Like here, we are discussing about data source. So, we will be discussing various steps of creating the data source. Look, the steps that we are going to discuss here, they may vary from one system to another. Like if you are using one kind of database, these steps will be little different. If you are using another database, these steps will be little different. But the basic understanding of it, we are making here. That whenever we need to create a data source, what all are the basic things that we can do. Here we are going to discuss the basic steps which are generally required to be done when you want to create a data source. And these may vary from one database to another. So, let us discuss the generalized steps of creating the data source. The very first step, we have the Start tab. On the Start tab, we have to click Set up Data Source. With the help of Set up Data Source, what we are doing? We are starting our data source. So, the very first step for creating a data source for us will be, we have to go to the Start tab and we have to click on the Set up Data Source option. Second step, our data source tab will be displayed. Once you have clicked on Set up Data Source, you will be displayed with the Data Source tab. Now, we have the third step. In the name field, we have to type the name of new data source, because here we are creating a new data source into which we want to store our data. So, the very third step would be to name this data source. That will be done in the name field of that. After this, we need to specify the type of data source. There are different types of data source. So, for our own application, for our own project, we need to specify that what type of data source do we want. After this, we have to modify the connection of URL, because we need to connect it to various servers. So, we need to specify to modify the connection of our URL, which is the Uniform Resource Locator. Now, after doing this, we type a username and the password which gives access to the data source. Now, this data source, it should not be accessible to everyone. But since we require certain form of authentication, if our data source that we have developed, we give its access to everyone, what will happen? Anyone would come and make changes into it. Anyone, any unauthorized person, he can also come and perform some miscellaneous activity on our data source. So that this step is very important. We have to type a username and the password which will give access to the data source. That will be the next step. After that, we have to select whether a user, he must be authenticated when accessing the data source. Now, if this option is selected, so in that case, authentication will be required when accessing the connection either by the user or by a simple plugin. And if it is not selected, the credential which is supplied in the above steps, that would be the username and the password, they will be used for all the users. Even if the user authentication it is selected, the username and the password, they must be supplied, since they are used by the information designer when using a data source with user authentication. The database administrator, he needs to make sure that the data source user, he has sufficient privileges so that he is allowed to truncate or drop some temporary table in the data source. Like I have told you that even a single click on your system will serve as a data and will be stored in the data source. So imagine how much of data is generated all the time. Even a single click, it is generating a form of data. So what do we require? We need to require to truncate, or we need to drop certain temporary tables. So our information designer, they should have that privilege so that they can be allowed to truncate or drop some temporarily table. So from the data source. So that privilege has to be given. After this, we enter any additional configuration setting that is required. If any additional configuration setting is required by us, we will enter that. If not required, we will simply click on the save button. So this is a basic process of creating a data source. So what we have seen here, whenever we have to create a data source is a place where we want to keep all the data. The very first step will be, we have to click on the Start tab and click on the data source option that we want to set up. After, the tab will be displayed. In the name field, we will type the name of the data source that we want to have. After that, we will specify the type of data source and we will modify the connection URL. After doing all this, another process is authentication. Authentication will be done by providing the credentials like the username and the password. This authentication, this is very much important. Why is this important? So that everyone does not gain access to your data source. So authentication is required. After this, authentication once is done, even if user authentication we have selected, the username and the password, they must be supplied so that the information designer, they can use it. Because when using a data source with the user authentication, administrator of that database, he needs to make sure that the data source user who are using the data source, they should have the privilege to delete some temporary table, to truncate few of the columns, to make some changes so that a lot of burden does not be there on the memory of the system where the data is being created. So these are few of the steps that we need to do when we have to create a data source for our business intelligence project. Now, our next topic here in this business intelligence project is creating the data view. Data view, it is a data structure or the visual representation of data which differs from the physical data. See, we have the physical data, all form of data, whatever we are supplying, that is the physical data. Now, making a proper representation of that data. So, data view, it is a data structure or the visual representation of data that will be different from the physical data. The way in which the data will be displayed into the form of some reports, into some other structural format. So, that will be the data view. Data view, it is a data structure or the visual representation of data which will be different from our physical data. A data view, it will enable you to create different views of data which are stored in the data table. A capability that is often used in the data binding application. Now, using a data view, you can expose the data in a table with different sort orders and you can filter the data by row state or based on some filter expression. So, basically data view is how you want to see the data. If you have a particular table, understand it with the help of simple example. If you have an Excel table, you have number of columns in that. If we are storing a student's information, so there will be the roll number, there might be the name, they can be the email ID, they can be the address, number of columns are there. Suppose I just want to know the roll number and the name of the student. So that will be my view for the data. I do not require any more columns other than this. I just want the roll number and the name of the student. So at that point of time, I am filtering some of the data. So that particular thing that I'm viewing, it is a form of data view. So in data view, you can expose the data in the table with different sort order. You can sort that data. Suppose you want to alphabetically sort your data. Suppose you want the roll number to come in the descending order for some reason. So you can sort your data and you can filter the data. Whatever data you want, you can have. Rest of the data you do not want, you do not have. So based on the row state or based on the filter expression, you can do this. So that is the data view. It is not the exact data, not the physical data. It is the form of the data that the user wants to see. So data view report, it must be based on some predefined data views. The data view defined for report output, it is much like any other predefined data view, but with a specific requirement for the output. So whatever output the user wants, whatever form into the data of the user wants, that has to be displayed. In the report, that has to be given. So that is what is data view. Not the entire data, only the required data. It will be displayed to the user as per his specific requirement. Now, here we are going to talk about the various steps of our data view. if we want to create the data view for our application. How can we do this? So there are few steps for that. The very first step is create a predefined data view which contains all the data fields or the columns that you want to display on the report output. So the very first step is you should create a predefined data view. A predefined data view which will contain the data fields and the column that you want to see. Now, the second step, when creating this predefined data view, you have to make sure that you include these specification in addition to whatever other specification you want to make on the data view setup form. After doing this, we will launch the data view and verify that the data you want is displayed correctly. After launching the data view, we have to verify that is it the correct form of data in the way we want? Do we have the correct column? Do we have the correct fields in this particular data view? We'll launch the data view and verify the data. After this, we close the data view result form and return to the data view setup form and just refresh it. That means till here our data view has been created. After this, what we need to do? We need to select the layout tab and verify that your layout tab displays in the list of layout. That means whatever data view you have created, has it come there? If it has come there, you have to just simply save and close the data view result form. So these are few steps to create the data view. And like I earlier also told you that these steps, they will vary from one application to another. If you're using MS Access, you're using Oracle, you are using Amazon DB, whatever database you are using, wherever you are creating these data sources, these steps, they will vary from application to application. Here, we are discussing the generalized step. If you have the understanding of this, these general steps, what you can do, you can open your application and refer to these steps and accordingly perform your application. Now, here we are going to discuss the next thing, which is modifying the data view. Once we have created the data view, that means we have selected few of the columns, we have filtered some of the data and we have created a data view. That is done. Now we need to modify the data view. When you add a map table to an analytic data view, the current data access plan, it automatically associates the table attributes with the data from the selected terminal node. Now, you can change the mapped stream to associate the table with different data. By changing the mapped stream, you can also change the overall model structure. Now, how? For example, you can add new attributes to the existing table. That means you want to modify your data view. You have created an earlier data view. Now you want to add some more attributes to the existing table. We already have a data view. We want to make some modification into that.